So I'm happy to be here tonight presenting, and what I'm going to do is run through the slides that we have here. It should be probably about 30 minutes that we'll get through that. And then, like Mr. Robinson said, questions, if you think of them as we're going along here, just throw them in the chat. And if they're not answered during the presentation inside that chat window, then we'll make sure to get to them at the end and we can go through them. So we'll get started here. And so this is just a little overview of what we're going to be doing. We're going to explain what financial aid is. We're going to define terms like cost of attendance, expected family contribution. We'll explain financial need, what that is, how it's calculated. I'll review the different types of financial aid. We'll talk about the FAFSA, and then we'll also discuss special circumstances. So what is a special circumstance if you have one, how to present that, and all that. So financial aid is any type of funding that a student receives to help pay for their cost of education. So no matter what that is, where it comes from, if it's a grant, a loan, a scholarship, if it's anything that's money specifically for the student to help them pay for their education, it's considered financial aid. It's considered part of their financial aid package. While you're going through this financial aid process and visiting different websites for financial aid offices at universities and having conversations with the financial aid office and receiving financial aid award letters, you're going to see this term here a lot, this cost of attendance. So the cost of attendance represents an overall cost at that school for one academic year. The cost of attendance is built of both direct and indirect costs. So a direct cost is something that a student is actually charged by the university, right? So it's a real charge that goes on their bill and must be paid. Examples of direct costs are tuition and fees, room and board, right? So those are real charges, you'll see them on there. But cost of attendance also includes indirect costs. So expenses that a university expects a student will have for the year, but not that they're actually going to be billed for. So an example would be like transportation. So maybe a school, estimates that a student is going to spend $800 per semester on transportation. They would include that indirect cost into their overall cost of attendance when they're building this cost of attendance that they have to publish and advertise as what the cost of attendance is at that school. So when you receive financial aid award letters and when you're looking at cost of attendance figures, just make sure you know exactly which items are direct costs and which items are indirect costs. The expected family contribution is another term that you're going to see a lot, hear a lot about when you are applying for financial aid and submitting the FAFSA and receiving your award letter and talking to financial aid office. You'll hear this EFC a lot. So the EFC is a value that's calculated by the Department of Education when the student submits the FAFSA. So student fills out the FAFSA, contains all of that income information, goes to the Department of Ed. They calculate this expected family contribution. It can range from 0 all the way up to $999,999. And the EFC value is super important because it's going to determine eligibility for lots of things, right? So eligibility for federal grant funding is determined by the student's EFC. The EFC is the same no matter where the student attends. It's just a value that's calculated by the Department of Ed when you submit that FAFSA. And those two blocks that you see here, student contribution, parent contribution, that's because you're reporting on the FAFSA income information for both the student and income information for the parent. Both of those together will make up this EFC. And so you take both of those two terms or both of those two items, right? The cost of attendance and the EFC. And that's how you determine a student's financial need. So this is the formula that's used by every financial aid office at every school when determining a student's financial need. So they'll take that cost of attendance, subtract the EFC, that's the financial need. So for example, let's say the school you're attending has a cost of attendance of $50,000 and the student family EFC is $10,000, then that student is going to demonstrate a financial need of $40,000. So the job of the financial aid office is to put together a financial aid package that includes any financial aid funding that the student is eligible for in order to help meet that financial need. And we'll come back to this financial need and how it's treated individually at different schools a little later on here. Two categories of financial aid. There is need-based aid and non-need-based aid. So need-based aid is, as it sounds, right? It's financial aid that is based on the student's financial need. So that's going to be, grant funding, things like that. So you're only going to be eligible for grant funding if you demonstrate financial need. Non-need-based aid, again, like it sounds, has nothing to do with the student's financial need. So think like academic scholarships, athletic scholarships, right? Funding that a student might be eligible for, but has no relation to their financial need at all. These are the different types of financial aid. And you can see that there's aid that's considered self-help and aid that is considered gift. So our first example of gift aid scholarships. So again, academic scholarships, athletic scholarships, any type of scholarship funding that the student receives is gift money, free money, right? So it's not anything that needs to be earned or repaid. It's just funding that the student receives for their education. Just like grants, grants are considered gift aid because there's no obligation to earn it first and there's no repayment obligation. And so our first example of self-help aid is work study. So as you're applying for financial aid, you might see that work study is included in a financial aid package. And that is an opportunity for a student to work a certain job on campus, earn money, just like a regular job, right? Biweekly paycheck for the hours that they worked in that pay period. That's just money that's paid to the student for them to use for whatever they need, right? But it's considered financial aid because it's meant to help with the cost of education. It's self-help because it's funding, but it has to be earned first. And then loans, of course, there is a repayment obligation, right? So you receive loan funding, there's an obligation to repay there. So it's considered self-help aid. And I point these types of aid out, self-help aid, gift aid, because you might find as you apply for financial aid and start receiving financial aid award letters, you might see some schools who actually separate your awards out into those categories. They might have in the financial aid award letter where it shows here are your gift aid items, here are your self-help aid items. Sometimes schools will list it like that. So if you see them broken out like that, that's the difference and that's what that means. These are your 5 major sources of financial aid, and we will look at all 5 of them. So the federal government is by far the largest provider of financial aid, awarding billions of dollars of funding every year. The majority of financial aid that the government awards is going to be based on the student's financial need. A student has to submit the FAFSA every year in order to receive federal funding. And there are certain eligibility requirements that the government has on federal aid recipients. So for example, there are citizenship requirements. There are academic progress requirements. So while a student is enrolled and receiving federal funding, there are academic progress requirements that the student must meet in order to continue receiving federal funding, right? So at the end of every year, students' academic progress is going to be monitored by that financial aid office. Is the student meeting the academic progress requirements to continue receiving their federal funding? Yes or no? Because of course, the federal government's not going to be allowing students to continue receiving federal aid funding if they're actually failing those classes. These are the major federal aid programs, and we'll go through each of these. The largest grant program by far is the federal Pell Grant program. The federal Pell Grant eligibility is determined by that EFC value, right? So when I was saying before how there's a range of EFCs starting at 0 all the way up to like 1 million. A student who has an EFC between 0 and 5,846 will be eligible for some amount of federal Pell Grant funding. The maximum that a student could receive this year is $6,495. So a student who has an EFC of 0, right, that low end of the range, is going to receive that maximum Pell Grant, $6,495. And as the EFC goes up to that 5,800 number, then the amount of Pell Grant funding that they receive starts decreasing. The Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grant, that is grant funding for a student who is not eligible for Pell Grant funding based on their EFC, but has a parent or guardian who was a member of the US Armed Forces and who died as a result of military service performed in Iraq or Afghanistan after the events of 9/11. So EFC doesn't matter here. If a student has a parent or guardian who fits that condition, then the student would be awarded the maximum Pell Grant, that's $6,495. Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, that's a long name there. You'll see it as SEOG, FSEOG, it'll be referred to. That is federal grant funding that's reserved really for the students who demonstrate the greatest amount of financial need. So the awards there range between $100,000 and $4,000 per year. SEOG, FSEOG funding is eligibility for that is determined by the individual school. So federal Pell Grant, if you have an EFC that's inside that range, boom, you're automatically going to get it. SEOG funding, that's awarded more at the discretion of the university. And it's because every university gets a certain amount of FSEOG funding. Some schools receive only a little bit, other schools receive a lot. So schools have their own method to determine what an FSEOG eligible student is and how much to award that student. It's a much smaller grant program than the Pell Grant program. So it would not be uncommon to receive a financial aid offer where you're receiving a federal Pell Grant, but not an FSEOG grant. The Teach Grant, that I would say you see that more often from universities for their graduate programs, but there are definitely universities who award it to undergraduates as well. Teach Grant funding, the awards you can receive up to $4,000 per year. In order to be eligible for Teach Grant funding, you have to be enrolled in a school that participates in the Teach program. Not all schools do. You have to be in a Teach eligible program, so like an education major. In order to receive it, you would have to agree to teach in a high need field in a school district which serves low-income students for a minimum of 4 years. So a student can receive this Teach Grant funding, right? So while they're enrolled, if they know, yep, I'm an education major, I'm going to become a teacher, and yes, I will sign this agreement with the Department of Ed to teach in a high need field in a school district which serves low-income students, then you could receive up to $4,000 per year in Teach Grant funding. If for any reason the student fails to fulfill that obligation, let's say they teach for only 2 years, or they teach in a high need field in a low income school district for only 3 years, and they don't finish that 4-year obligation. If for any reason they fail to meet that obligation, the government turns that grant into a loan with interest effective the first day that the student received that grant funding. So for that reason, it's definitely something that if you're eligible for, you just want to make sure to think about it carefully, because that could be, a fair number of years where if you don't actually meet that obligation, that's a lot of interest to be added on very quickly. Federal Work Study, that is a program where students can find a job working on campus for a federal work study position to, like I said earlier, work what is essentially, right, just like regular job, work, whatever those hours are in that pay period, you'll get paid for. Money gets paid to you, the student, just like any other job. And it's your money to spend however you need. It's not something that you earn and gets applied to your student account. It's not anything like that. It's just like a regular job that you would get paid those wages for, just like anything else. The majority that you'll see are paid at the federal minimum wage. And so when I've talked to students in the past about them considering, do I want to, spend my extra hours that I have working a federal work study job here on campus, or do I want to try and get a job off campus that maybe, I can earn more money with? What I've always said to them is one of the advantages with like a work study job is maybe not only location wise, it's right there on campus for you, but federal work study supervisors, so you're working for a department on campus, they recognize that a student's education always comes first ahead of that job, right? So as an example, the students who were federal work study students in my office when I was working on campus, if ever there was a day where they were like, oh, I have a huge test tomorrow, do you care if I skip this shift so I can study for it? Yeah, sure, no problem, go study for it, that's great. Are other jobs going to be as flexible? Probably not as flexible as like a federal work study employer might be. So there are definitely advantages there. Federal direct student loans. So of course, loan funding is a big piece of a financial aid package. And when you receive a financial aid offer from a university, whatever federal loan funding a student's eligible for, they're going to include in there. Federal direct loans are automatically granted to students. There's no type of like credit check or anything like that. If you're a student enrolled in an institution, you can receive federal student loan funding. There are 2 types of student loan funding that a student might receive. There is unsubsidized loan funding and there's subsidized loan funding. Unsubsidized loan funding has no financial need component. So you don't need to demonstrate any amount of financial need to receive unsubsidized loan funding. Subsidized loan funding does have a financial need component. So a student must demonstrate financial need in order to receive subsidized loan funding. They both have the exact same interest rate, which right now this year is 3.73%. The difference between the two is that for an unsubsidized loan, the interest is going to begin accruing immediately during enrollment. So from the day that loan is dispersed to your student account, interest will begin accruing immediately. On a subsidized loan, the interest is not going to begin accruing until after the student graduates or ceases attendance. So if any reason they stop attending, they drop out or whatever it is, when the student ceases attendance, that's when the interest begins accruing on a subsidized loan. So for that reason, subsidized loan funding is preferable. What I would say is the majority of students are going to receive a combination of unsubsidized and subsidized loan funding in their financial aid package. So when you receive a financial aid award letter, if it's your first year, your freshman year in college, you might see that you're being offered $3,500 in unsubsidized loan funding, or in subsidized loan funding, and $2,000 in unsubsidized. You might see like a combination there. So there is a 1% origination fee on a loan. So what that means is, if you are taking out a, $1,000 loan, they're going to take 1% of that away before they actually send the money to the school. So there's a small origination fee, but something to keep in mind and remember. And then there is student loan funding available for parents of dependent students, and that's with the Federal Plus loan. So that is loan funding that parents of dependent students can apply for. There is a credit process there. So unlike regular student loans where the student is the borrower and there's no type of credit check at all, Federal Parent Plus loans, there is a credit application process, although it's not your typical, right? So for pretty much every type of loan that you apply for, there's going to be a credit score check and a debt to income ratio. There is none of that in the Parent Plus loan. So the Parent Plus loan is just looking for adverse credit history. So the Department of Ed has their own kind of unique credit process. And so because it is this kind of unique credit check process that they do, I've had situations where, parents think, oh, I'm going to apply for that loan and there's no way I'll be approved, and they get approved and they're surprised. But then I've also had the reverse where parents think like, oh, sure, I'll get approved for that loan, no problem. And they get denied and they're surprised. So if additional loan funding is something that you're considering as the parent, you might want to consider Parent Plus loan funding. It has a 6.28% interest rate. Interest begins accruing immediately upon disbursement. So when that student or when that loan hits the student's account, that's when interest will begin accruing. And there is a 4% origination fee on Parent Plus loan funding. So origination fees higher than regular student loan funding. It can be a big chunk, especially if you're borrowing a large Parent Plus loan. So let's say you're taking out a Parent Plus loan of $20,000 for that academic year. They're going to take 4% right off the top as that origination fee. But still, I would say if you're considering borrowing, loan funding yourself as the parent, Plus loans are still very competitive in comparison to some of those other lenders, right? So like those big name, like the Sallie Mae's or the Citizens, Plus loans are still very competitive there. There we go. So after the federal government, state funding is your next biggest source of financial aid. And here in Pennsylvania, there are a few sources of funding. So Pennsylvania state funding is managed by PHEAA, P-H-E-A-A. It's the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency. And in order to receive Pennsylvania state grant funding, you must be a Pennsylvania resident. You must file the FAFSA by May 1st every year if you're attending a four-year institution, or August 1st of every year if you're attending a community college. And Pennsylvania State Agency is very strict with those FAFSA deadlines. If you file that FAFSA on May 2nd, I've seen many times where a student misses that deadline by one day and there's no recourse. the state agency very rarely will grant exceptions for missing that deadline of May 1st, or like I said, August 1st, if you're attending community college. The eligibility is again determined by student EFC and all that FAFSA information, right? So when you submit that FAFSA, it's going to go to the Department of Ed, and it's also going to go to Pennsylvania State Grant Agency. There's a separate application process that you'll finish there. But they're going to use all that information to determine your eligibility. And just like with the federal Pell Grant, there's kind of a range, right? So the maximum Pennsylvania State Grant this year is $5,000, but based on students' EFC, they might receive, 3,400, something like that. So there's a range there, just like Pell Grant. Information. Oh, state aid application. Like I was saying, when you're submitting that FAFSA, at the very end, you do that signature page of the FAFSA. There's going to be a link there for you to link to the Pennsylvania State application, and definitely do that right away. The state aid application is going to take most of the information that's needed from the FAFSA. So when you follow that link and go onto the state grant website, there's only going to be a few more questions and items that you have to provide, but you definitely want to finish that up as soon as you submit that FAFSA, because you don't want to have to worry about going back to it later. So definitely, as soon as you hit submit on FAFSA, follow that link to the Pennsylvania State application. So like I said, only eligible for Pennsylvania residents. Oh, and also only eligible for when you're attending a school in Pennsylvania, unless you are attending a school in one of the reciprocal states. And there are 6 reciprocal states. It's Delaware, DC, Massachusetts, Ohio, Vermont, and West Virginia. So if you're attending a school out of state in one of those states, you can receive your Pennsylvania state grant funding, but only up to $600. So for the most part, Pennsylvania does not allow its state grant funding to leave the state of Pennsylvania. But if you do attend in one of those reciprocal states, you could receive up to $600. So, and then, some of those other programs that the state manages are for students who were in foster care or aged out of foster care. So there's 2 programs. There's the Chafee Grant Program. The maximum grant for that is $6,000 per year. And so in order to be eligible for Chafee funding, you have to be identified as a youth in foster care or discharged from foster care at age 16. There is a separate application process for that. So you would go to the Pennsylvania State Grant webpage and use the link to get to the Chafee grant to submit that. And then when you submit, or if you submit for Chafee funding, if you are a foster care student, then you'll also, when you submit that Chafee application, they're also going to consider you for the foster ed program, which is a newer program. And it's really cool because what they do is they meet the remaining financial need at wherever you're attending. So after all your other financial aid awards, whatever the remaining balance is, the foster ed program would kick in and meet that remaining balance. So those are 2 really good programs for any student who was in the foster care system. So then colleges and universities themselves are going to be large sources of financial aid funding. So a university might have an academic scholarship program, maybe they have an athletic scholarship program. So maybe the university has their own institutional funding that they award based on academic or athletic or financial need, because a school might have its own institutional grant program to help students with their financial need. There are some schools who advertise themselves as full need schools, right? So when we were looking at that formula earlier and we were seeing how a student's financial need is determined, right? We were saying cost of attendance minus EFC, that's the student's financial need. So a school who advertised themselves as a full need school who meets the full financial need of their students, they would be meeting that whatever the remaining balance is after all the other financial aid awards have been calculated and eligibility for all those have been entered in the financial aid package. Admittedly, those schools are fewer in number, right? And it's typically those like highly selective institutions, right? So here in Pennsylvania, it's like your Lafayette's, your Haverford's, your Lehigh University. Those schools advertise themselves as schools who meet the full financial need for their students. And then you have so many institutions in Pennsylvania, right, or wherever, who maybe they have smaller institutional grant programs. So maybe they're meeting only a percentage of the student's financial need. And then you have schools who might not have any institutional program of their own. So maybe they're just including, federal or state aid, but there's no aid being offered by the institution themselves. And so because of that reason, you are going to receive financial aid award letters if you're applying to multiple schools and applying for financial aid at multiple schools. Your financial aid offers are going to look different from every school, right? The majority of schools are just going to use the information from the FAFSA, but some schools are going to require that a student submit an additional application, and that could be something institutional. More likely, if they're asking for something in addition to the FAFSA, it's going to be that CSS profile. So you might see that name when you're searching and in this financial aid process as you're looking at different schools. You might see some schools who say we require both the FAFSA and the CSS profile. Typically, again, it's going to be some of those schools that are those like highly selective, like I was saying earlier, those Haverfords, those Lehighs. Those are usually the schools who are going to require both FAFSA and CSS profile. CSS profile is an application that's going to take student, family, income information, but it takes a much deeper look into family finances, and it considers things that the FAFSA does not, right? So when you're submitting the FAFSA does not care about the value of your primary home, but the CSS profile is going to care about that value of the primary home. They're going to want to know how much equity you have in that. So the CSS profile is just a much more in-depth picture of family finances. So make sure to pay attention if the school is requesting both, and then make sure to pay attention to any deadlines that the institution posts, right? So like the Pennsylvania State Grant Agency, who says FAFSA must be in by May 1st, different schools can set their own FAFSA deadlines too. They might have like a priority deadline to say you must submit your FAFSA by March 15th if you want to be considered for our institutional aid, things like that. So make sure as you're looking at the different websites that you note if they have their own institutional deadline. Private sources, another place to look for financial aid funding. Examples here, right, would be like when a student is searching for different scholarship opportunities. And, there are kind of like those websites that you hear about and see a lot, like the FastWeb, scholarship.com, things like that. So you can go online, search for scholarships. What I would say is when you're searching for scholarship opportunities from private sources like this, the success rate that you'll have with local, regional kind of groups or organizations, you'll have a better success rate there than if you're applying for, say like a Coca-Cola scholarship that's just posted on their website, something like that, where you're competing against thousands of other people. So when I would have students who would come in or would be enrolled and they would say, oh, I've got $1,000 from here, I've got $500 from there, I got 2,000 from this. It was always something like, oh, I've got a $1,000 scholarship from the Women's Club of Westfield, New Jersey, something like that, right? And you have better success rates there, not only because generally there's fewer people applying for those, but if it's a local, regional, state kind of thing, they like to award locally, regionally, right? You could look at like Chamber of Commerce websites sometimes will post scholarship opportunities that they have. So look for kind of things like that, and I think you'll have better success rates. There we go. Similar kind of deal with employers, right? So whether it's the employer of the student or employer of the parent, if you find that they have their own scholarship programs or scholarship opportunities, that's kind of a prime place to look. Again, one of those places where you might have a better success rate than if you're just going on like fastweb.com and searching for whatever is posted randomly online. Okay, so FAFSA, right? Like we were saying before, that is the application that you have to submit every year in order to receive federal funding. And it's what schools and state agencies are all going to use that information to determine your eligibility. So you're going to have to submit your demographic, your financial information. That's how your EFC gets calculated. Comes out October 1 every year, the year prior, right? So that's next Friday. So next Friday, the 22-23 FAFSA is going to be released for students who are enrolling fall 2022. You can complete that FAFSA as early as next Friday. These are the different ways that you can submit the FAFSA. So that first one there is FAFSA on the web. That's just going to the website and filling it out there from your computer. Then there's an app that they launched probably 3 years ago now, I guess, that they launched the app. You could still complete a paper FAFSA. It is possible, not recommended, but you could. If needed for some reason, you could request it. FAFSA on the phone. I have literally never heard of anyone doing that ever. So don't do it. Don't even try. The access to CPS online that would have to be something like really exceptional, because that would have to be like a financial aid administrator kind of creating the FAFSA for you directly in the Department of Ed website. And it would have to be a really rare circumstance to require that. So really your options are going online there to that website or using the app. This is the graphic here of the FAFSA page, and that's the link there that you're going to use. When you are going to complete your FAFSA, make sure that you don't just type FAFSA into whatever search bar and end up at like FAFSA.com or something like that. Make sure you're actually on the studentaid.gov website, because there are those like scam websites out there that try to mimic. So just make sure that you're on the studentaid.gov site when you're starting this. Login options, this is new, which is cool. So now with the FAFSA, you can log in either as the student or as the parent. So in the past, you could only ever log in as the student only. But now it's like there's 2 roles, and each role can sign in independently. So the student can sign in, complete their section, the parent can sign in, still reach that same application to complete their section. So this is a good new feature that they have. This is just a graphic of what the app would look like if you download it here. And same thing, it would give you those roles there that you could choose from. Same thing, just another graphic of what that app looks like. As you move through it, it'll tell you the sections that you have completed, right? See that little green check mark? It's like, yep, you've done section 1. Now you're moving on to section 2. The confirmation page here that you reach at the end when you finish the FAFSA, that will give you this congratulations message. And it will also display what the EFC is right away. It'll say what the EFC had been calculated for the student is. And like I said, also at this end here is where you are going to find that link for the state page. Because once you're done FAFSA, immediately move on and complete that state application. While you are in the FAFSA, you'll see the option to use the IRS data retrieval tool. This is definitely recommended. It's a really convenient way to get all of your income information into the FAFSA as opposed to having to manually type it all in. So the way this works is it'll say, do you want to use the IRS data retrieval tool? And then it will link you directly to the IRS. And then all that IRS data that you had filled out will transfer over to the FAFSA automatically. So definitely will save you time. And that last bullet there, it says reduces documents requested by the financial aid office. That's because the Department of Ed selects approximately 20% of all FAFSAs to be verified. What that means is they would be tasking the financial aid office with verifying that everything you reported is accurate on the FAFSA. So if that happens, and like I said, it happens about 20% of all FAFSAs, so it's not a major deal. If your FAFSA is selected for verification, the financial aid office will let you know, and they'll say, oh, you've been selected for verification. We need XYZ documents. If you've used the IRS data retrieval tool, you won't have to submit as many documents because the IRS data retrieval tool came directly from the IRS, so the financial aid office knows that they can trust that. So for expediency and for just ease, if your FAFSA is selected for verification, definitely recommend to use the data retrieval tool. Certain people cannot use the data retrieval tool, and these are the different reasons why somebody would not be allowed to use the data retrieval tool. So if they did not file a tax return for that year, if you were married but filed separate returns, so there's different reasons why you would not be able to. FSA ID is like a username and a password that you create, just like how you create a username and a password for so many different accounts, right? Creating an FSA ID is creating your username and your password that allows you to access the different federal student aid websites. I would recommend creating this before you start the FAFSA. You can begin the FAFSA without creating the FSA ID first, because when you get to that login page, you can log in using your FSA ID, or you can log in using like your social security number. I definitely recommend creating this first though, before you start that FAFSA. You can use the FSA ID to sign the FAFSA, which is an important thing. It must be signed. Every user would need their own unique FSA ID. So the student would need their own, parent would need their own, cannot share. The FSA IDs have to be 100% unique. So a student and a parent can't share the same email address when creating FSA IDs, anything like that. They have to be totally unique. But I definitely recommend creating the FSA ID before you start that FAFSA. General student information. So yeah, so as you're submitting the FAFSA, you're gonna have to provide information like this: social security number, citizen status, like I was saying before, must be a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen. An example of an eligible non-citizen would be a permanent resident, or if someone had been granted refugee status or asylum had been granted by the Citizen Immigration Services office. So there are certain eligible non-citizen categories that could make you eligible for federal funding. Have to report marital status, of course. So different things like that that you're reporting in addition to income information. Student dependency status. So when you're submitting that FAFSA, students are going to have to submit their own student income information, everything like that, as well as parent information if the student is dependent. For the most part, any student under the age of 24 is going to be considered dependent by the Department of Ed. There'll be a series of questions that the FAFSA asks you, yes or no, to determine your dependency status. But like I said, for the most part, anybody 24 or under is considered dependent by Department of Ed. Doesn't matter if the student is 18, lives in their own apartment, pays all their own bills, has zero support from parent. If parent is alive and anywhere around, Department of Ed is going to say you're dependent. The exceptions would be if the student is under 24 but married, or under 24 but has children that they support themselves, or is a veteran, or is in active duty in the armed forces, or if they were an emancipated minor, if they were in foster care, if they were homeless. So there are certain exceptions to dependency status if a student's under 24, but for the most part, under 24, Department of Ed is consider you dependent. And so this just shows you the different things that's going to require that's submitted about parents of dependent students. And information about the student, same items are going to have to be submitted. And just additional things here, right? College information, what colleges are you applying to? You're going to submit those, you're going to enter those in the FAFSA, what your housing plans are, on campus, off campus, FAFSA preparer information. That's only if you've paid someone to complete the FAFSA for you. So like you would pay like a tax preparer, if you were to pay someone to complete your FAFSA for you, then that FAFSA preparer would have to include their information on the FAFSA. For the most part, I recommend students and families, avoid using a FAFSA preparer, if only because the financial aid office at whatever schools you're looking at are generally going to be willing to help you for free, right, to submit that FAFSA. So, but in the case that you do pay someone to do the FAFSA, they're going to have to enter their information there. At the end there of the FAFSA, you're going to have to sign it. Both the student and the parent are going to need to sign the FAFSA, and you can sign it either by using the FSA ID, right, or by printing the signature page and then mailing that signature page. But I definitely don't recommend that, just because then it ends up causing a delay in between the time that the school receives the FAFSA and by the time the mail is sent to, I think the office is in Tennessee that you have to send it, by the time it's sent there, received, processed. So I definitely recommend signing using that FSA ID. So a list of different mistakes that people make sometimes when they're submitting the FAFSA. Social security number is a really annoying error to try and correct. So I definitely recommend when you are sitting down to do the FAFSA, make sure that you have your social security numbers in front of you, that you can see them, and you're not just like, oh, I'm pretty sure this is what it is, because it's a headache to correct a FAFSA with an incorrect social security number. It's a headache for the student to try and fix it. It's a headache for the financial aid office when they receive that FAFSA and then it doesn't match to any of their student records. So definitely just make sure you have it for sure when you're typing it out. Divorced, remarried, parental information. So sometimes people make the mistake there, right? So let's say the student's parents are divorced and they're reporting the information for their custodial parent, right? So if that parent is remarried, then they must include that step parent information as well. It can't be excluded. If they are married, then step parent information must also be included. So it's a mistake sometimes that's made. Untaxed income. So when you're reporting untaxed income, it's going to ask for things like your retirement account. Like it's going to want to know what you contributed to your retirement account that year, but it doesn't want to know the full value of your retirement account. That does not count at all. You should not report that on the FAFSA. But whatever you contributed to that retirement account during that tax year is going to be considered untaxed income. Household size, number in college, if you've got 4 people in the household, 2 parents, 2 children, let's say that the older sibling is, 28 and they still live at home, they're still dependent on the parent and they're attending grad school, right? You would still report them as a household member in college. So don't exclude them just because, maybe they're older than 26 or make that mistake or something like that. You just don't report the parents. The FAFSA doesn't care if the parent is enrolled in college at all. You only report any of the dependents who are enrolled in college in that year. Real estate. So again, FAFSA does not ask you for the value of your primary home. So make sure, do not make that mistake. Do not report that there. But if you have like a second property, then you'd be reporting the equity that you have there, right? So not the full value of the property, whatever your equity is in there, that would be considered your real estate asset there on any second properties. This graphic here just shows what happens to your FAFSA when you submit it. It goes to the central processing system, and then the central processing system sends out 2 reports, one to the student, one to the college. Student will receive what's called a SAR, a student aid report. If the student included their email when they complete that FAFSA, which you probably will, then they'll email you the student aid report. If for some reason you did the FAFSA without an email address, they would print it and mail one to you. The other report that they send to the college is the ICER, and that just has all of that data from the FAFSA that the school uses when they're creating your financial aid package. If corrections are needed to the FAFSA, that's fine. You can easily make corrections just by logging back into the FAFSA, changing whatever is an error, and then submitting again. And if for some reason it was something that the financial aid office needed to correct for you, then they could correct it on their side. So if you make a mistake, no worries, you can definitely correct it. Okay, so special circumstances. So when you're submitting the FAFSA, you are reporting your income, your tax information from 2 years prior. So with this 22-23 FAFSA that's being released next week, when you fill that out, you're going to be reporting on your 2020 taxes. So a lot of things can happen in 2 years, right? So if there is some kind of difference in the student or family finances between that tax year that you're reporting on and current day, right? There might be a special circumstance there. So that's not something that you can explain on the FAFSA. It's something that you would have to address with the financial aid office, and it's something you'd have to address individually with every financial aid office where you're applying. Because each financial aid office is going to have their own process for it, and they're going to have their own decisions that they make when considering your special circumstance. So this graphic here is a list of some of like your most common special circumstances. And by far, the most common one is loss of employment or income, right? So for example, 2020 tax year form is, or 2020 tax year is reported on in the FAFSA. Let's say since then, one of the parents has become unemployed. Well, now that income is no longer, right? So what you would want to do is present to the financial aid office, hey, I have this special circumstance because I know I submitted my FAFSA using my 2020 tax information, but my income is much different today than it was 2 years ago because loss of employment. And every financial aid office is very familiar with special circumstance, the word special circumstance. They'll know exactly what you're talking about. If you were to call them up and say like, hey, I think I have a special circumstance, can I talk it through with you? Most financial aid offices are going to have a process already in place. So they might say to you, yep, we have a form for that. Fill out what you think your special circumstance is, submit it back to us. And it really is the discretion of each financial aid office. So what I always say is you could submit the same special circumstance to 6 different schools and you could get back 6 different answers, because one school might say, well, we don't consider that special circumstance, we're not going to process it. Another school would say, yes, we do consider that special circumstance. Please help us document it. We're going to need, proof of unemployment compensation, maybe a copy of a severance letter if you got that, your current W-2 or current pay stub if you got a new job and you're making less than what the old job was. What that financial aid office will do is actually manipulate the data that's on the FAFSA to recalculate the student's eligibility, right? So they'll take that new information, they'll recalculate the student's EFC and recalculate the student's financial need and try and figure out, okay, does this open up the student to any additional federal grant funding, any institutional grant funding? Do we think it'll help them get any state grant funding? Because like I was saying before, each financial aid office is different. You're going to have to present it individually to each one. And then you would also have to present it to the state grant agency as well, because the state grant agency as well will process a special circumstance, but they have their own process too. So, it might be a little time consuming if you're needing to collect a whole bunch of different documents and submitting it to multiple parties, but it could very well be worth it, because if there is some kind of significant difference in the income from today versus tax year, it's worth exploring with the financial aid office to see if that opens the student to any additional eligibility. So that takes us to my very last slide. So if anybody wants me to revisit a topic, or if there are questions in here that I can answer, let me see if I know how to get to the chat.
Or we didn't have many questions in the chat.
Okay.
We just had one about the website. I do have one question that I wanted you to maybe visit. It would be about the primary custodian for divorced parents.
Okay.
If you could speak to how
Yep.
a parent, if they split their time 50-50,
Yeah.
if you know who would be the primary custodial parent in that situation.
Yep. So sometimes what people will make mistake on
Thor, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Whoops. Here, I'm back, right? Can you hear me?
You mute yourself.
No, he's not muted.
No, I'm not muted.
Oh,
Wait, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, good. All right. So I heard all of what your question was. So yes, that is a mistake that families sometimes make when they're trying to determine who the custodial parent is, right? And sometimes the confusion comes from which parent claimed the student as a dependent on their tax return, but that actually has nothing to do with it. Department of Ed doesn't care who claimed who on their tax return as a dependent. The custodial parent is the parent who the student lived with for the majority of the year. So if the student lived with parent one for, 7 months out of the year, parent one is that custodial parent. If the student truly splits their time like fully equally between both parents, then it would be the parent who provides the greater amount of financial support who is the custodial. But in most cases, you'll be able to determine that custodial parent just by who does the student reside with for the majority of the year. That is the custodial parent. And if that custodial parent is unmarried, then it would just be that custodial parent's income information. But if that custodial parent is since remarried, then it would be custodial parent plus step parent's information.
Thor, we have a question in the chat.
Okay.
It's going to be about just kind of talking again about the custodial parent and just kind of highlighting if the custodial parent is currently divorced, the custodial parent would just be the one putting the information on the FAFSA, correct? You're never going to put like two parents, even if they're both contributing to financially for the student.
Correct. On the FAFSA, no. If the parents are divorced, then the FAFSA only requires custodial parent information, which is different from CSS profile, because a lot of CSS profile schools are going to say, does not matter if parents are divorced, we require both. But for FAFSA, just custodial parent information. Unless, like I said, if that custodial parent had since remarried, then they would require the step parent information as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any more questions for the group? We definitely want to give a big thank you to Thor. I really
Oh,
appreciate
thank
you,
you.
you presenting for us.
Oh, that's very nice of you. Thank you. Happy to do it.
If any parents have any extra questions, they can send them to the counselors and we'll get back to you. We'll reach out to Thor.
Mhm.
And again, we're going to post this on Schoology and probably send it out to families as well through Guidance Messenger that we've been doing. So everybody have a great night. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you.